My sister told the 911 dispatcher that my 8-year-old son must have gotten into something on his own. She said she had no idea there were peanuts anywhere in the house. She said she was upstairs resting and did not even hear him fall. The emergency room called me 40 minutes after that. My son, Finn, was unconscious when the paramedics found him. Anaphylactic shock. His throat had swollen nearly shut. A 73-year-old neighbor named Mrs. Calloway had spotted him through the glass of my father's kitchen door, blue-lipped and slumped against the cabinet, and she had called 911 herself because no one inside that house had bothered to do it. I need you to understand something before I tell you how a family that owned 3 commercial properties in Jacksonville and a vacation home on Amelia Island could leave a child to die over a piece of paper. My name is Nina. I am 34 years old. For 6 years before I left the bureau, I worked financial crimes for the FBI out of the Atlanta field office. I spent my days tracing money through shell companies, identifying fraudulent wire transfers, building ironclad cases against people who thought they were too clever to be caught. When I left, I took everything I had learned and built Meridian Financial Forensics, a private consulting firm that now holds contracts with 4 Fortune 500 companies and 2 federal agencies. My family believed I ran a small accounting practice out of a rented office downtown. They thought I was barely keeping the lights on. That misunderstanding was the biggest mistake they ever made. Finn was supposed to be with my parents for one weekend. Just one. A high-value client in Chicago had flagged an irregularity in their acquisition documents Friday morning, and I had to fly out with 2 hours' notice. My regular sitter was visiting family in Georgia, and my father had called me the week before, out of the blue, asking if Finn could come stay soon. Said he missed his grandson. It seemed like a gift. Finn had his EpiPen in his backpack, clearly labeled. My mother knew about the allergy. Everyone in that house knew about Finn's peanut allergy. You do not forget a child nearly dies at Thanksgiving 3 years ago because someone brought pecan pie without warning anyone. I was still in the air when the hospital called. I landed, rented a car, and drove 90 minutes straight to the Jacksonville Pediatric Emergency Unit without stopping. When the attending physician met me in the corridor outside the PICU, she looked exhausted in the particular way doctors look when they have been fighting for something small and fragile. She told me Finn had received epinephrine in time. Mrs. Calloway had told the paramedics about his allergy the moment she called, bless that woman, but that he had experienced a severe hypoxic episode before they stabilized him. They were monitoring for cardiac involvement. He was sedated and on oxygen. I stood outside the glass of his room and looked at my son. He looked so small in that bed. He was wearing his dinosaur socks, the ones with the little T-Rex on the ankles. Someone had pulled his shoes off and set them on the chair beside him, and that detail, the careful placement of those small shoes, nearly broke something open inside me. It did not break. I do not crack under pressure. I redirect it. I had been standing at that window for maybe 20 minutes when I heard my sister's voice carrying from the elevator bank down the hall. My sister, Ingrid, has a voice that fills rooms the way expensive furniture fills rooms, loudly, without apology, as if the space exists for her benefit. She was talking to her husband, my brother-in-law Hollis, and from the cadence of her voice, I could tell before I even saw her face that she was annoyed rather than frightened. They came around the corner together. Ingrid was in a linen blazer and her good earrings. Hollis wore a collared shirt, khakis pressed. Neither of them looked like people who had just rushed from a bedside emergency. They looked like people who had taken a few minutes to change before arriving. My brother-in-law saw me first. Something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly, more like calculation, and then he smoothed it away and replaced it with concern. He was very good at that. He put one hand on my shoulder and said he was so glad I had made it, and his voice was warm in the practiced way that people who manipulate for a living can make their voices warm on command. My sister did not hug me. She stood beside him and crossed her arms and told me the doctors said Finn was going to be fine and that this whole thing had been a terrible accident and that she thought I needed to think carefully before I said anything to anyone that could blow this into something bigger than it was. Those were her exact words, blow this into something bigger than it was. I looked at my brother-in-law and asked him where Finn's EpiPen was. He said the paramedics must have it. I asked why Finn had not used it himself. Finn was trained to use it. We had practiced. He was 8 years old and he knew exactly what to do the moment his throat started to tighten. My brother-in-law said kids panic. He said it had been a confusing situation. I asked him who gave Finn peanut butter crackers. He stopped talking. There is a moment in any interrogation, and I have sat through many of them, on both sides of the table, when the subject realizes the person across from them knows more than they let on. I watched that moment happen behind my brother-in-law's eyes. His shoulders shifted. He glanced at my sister. She looked at the floor. He recovered quickly. He squared up and lowered his voice so the nurses at the station would not hear. He told me I needed to be very careful right now. He said my father was a respected man in this community, that he and my sister had a reputation to protect, and that the last thing any of us needed was for a medical incident to become a legal situation that embarrassed everyone. He mentioned, almost gently, that it might raise questions about why a single mother with an obviously stressful career was leaving her medically fragile child in the care of elderly grandparents. Then he reached inside his jacket pocket and placed a folded check on the arm of the waiting room chair between us. It was made out to my name, $40,000. He told me it was to cover whatever the insurance did not, and to take some time off, and to please understand that everyone in the family loved Finn, and that some things were better handled inside the family than through investigators. I looked down at the check. I had spent 6 years at the FBI building financial cases against men exactly like my brother-in-law. Hollis was originally from Savannah, old money adjacent but not actually old money, the kind of man who married into a wealthy black family because he knew how to present himself to fathers who needed that particular validation. He had been working inside my father's development company for 4 years. My father worshipped him. He had been grooming him to take over operational management for 2 years now. I picked up the check by its very edge, preserving the prints on the paper, old habit. I looked at the routing number in the lower left corner. After 6 years of financial forensics, routing numbers speak to me the way musical notes speak to someone with perfect pitch. That number did not belong to a domestic account. It was offshore. I folded the check and slid it into my jacket pocket without saying a single word. My brother-in-law seemed unnerved by my silence. He had expected tears. He had not expected a woman who looked at a $40,000 bribe the way a carpenter looks at a nail. He told me my father was at the house and wanted to speak with me. He said my father expected me before the weekend was over. I told him I would be there. He seemed satisfied. He took my sister's arm and they walked back toward the elevator. I waited until the doors closed. Then I walked to the stairwell, let the heavy door shut behind me, and I called my senior analyst. Reed had worked financial crimes with me at the Bureau for 3 years before we both left. He was the best I had ever worked with on digital forensics and reconstructing deleted transaction records. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed 2 things in parallel. First, I needed him to pull the security footage from my father's property. I gave him the address and the name of the security system my father used. I had installed that system myself 2 years ago as a birthday gift, and the administrative credentials were still in my secure vault. Second, I read him the routing number from the check and told him to run our full international banking trace and map every connected account. Reed said he would call me back within the hour. He called in 45 minutes. He started with the security footage. The kitchen. My brother-in-law opening the pantry cabinet, taking down a jar of peanut butter, spreading it on crackers, not by accident methodically, looking over his shoulder first, putting the crackers on a small plate, walking out of frame. My sister, 10 minutes later, in the hallway outside the guest room where Finn was napping, knocking on the door, handing him the plate with a smile. Finn taking it without hesitation. He trusted his aunt. Of course he did. 30 minutes after that, the hallway camera showed my nephew Beckett, Ingrid and Hollis's 10-year-old, going into Finn's room and coming out 2 minutes later with something in his closed fist. Reed zoomed in. When Beckett's hand opened briefly as he passed the camera on his way to his parents' room, what was visible was a yellow-capped auto-injector, Finn's EpiPen. My brother-in-law had planned the exposure. My sister had delivered it. My nephew had removed the one thing that could have saved Finn's life in time. They had known about this allergy for 3 years. This was not negligence. I sat in that stairwell for a long time after Reed finished talking. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. I pressed my back against the concrete wall and breathed the way my bureau supervisor had taught me to breathe when a case turned into something that made you want to stop being a professional and start being a person with a family. Then Reed told me what he found in the financial trace. The routing number connected to an account in the Cayman Islands registered to a holding company called Beaufort Capital Partners LLC. That was the top layer, 6 sub-entities beneath it. 3 of them had received wire transfers from my father's real estate development company over the past 18 months, recorded internally as consulting fees, no invoices filed, no contracted services, amounts between $80,000 and $240,000 per transfer, total identified just over $1.1 million. The bottom of the structure was worse. The lowest entity, an anonymous trust registered in the Cayman Islands 3 months ago, listed a beneficiary, not Hollis, not my sister. The name printed on the registration documents was Finn's, my son's full legal name and his social security number. Reed sent me the page. I zoomed in until the letters were the size of my thumbnail. I read his name 3 times. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I had prosecuted 2 cases at the Bureau using the same architecture. Hollis was moving money through my father's company into offshore accounts, and he had built a fall guy into the structure. If federal investigators ever traced the outgoing transfers, they would follow the chain to a trust registered in a child's name, a child whose mother had an FBI background, which made the frame even more elegant. And if Finn had died that afternoon in my father's kitchen, the trust and everything in it would have been attributed to a deceased minor whose mother was too devastated to mount an effective defense. Hollis had not just tried to hurt my son, he had tried to use him. I called Agent Dunbar. He had been my direct supervisor at the Atlanta office for 4 years and was now heading a financial crimes task force out of the Jacksonville Satellite Field office. I had his personal number. We had closed 3 major cases together. He picked up on the second ring. I drafted him a full encrypted brief through our secure channel. I attached the security footage, the Beaufort Capital structure, the wire transfer records, the Cayman Trust documents, the check, and the EpiPen footage with timestamp, including the frame capture showing my nephew walking out of Finn's room with the injector in his hand. I told Agent Dunbar that my father was hosting his company's annual charity gala in 3 days, 200 guests, local politicians, Chamber of Commerce leadership, real estate investors. Hollis was scheduled to be formally introduced as the incoming operations director of the company at the gala. It would be the largest possible public stage either of them would ever stand on. Agent Dunbar said federal warrants were being prepared. I told him I would be there. The next morning I went to my father's house. He met me at the door in his weekend clothes and looked at me with the expression he had worn my entire childhood when I did something that disappointed him. Not anger, more like weary certainty that I was the difficult one, the complicated daughter, the one who never made things easy. He told me Finn's reaction had been unfortunate, but that it was important for the family to present a unified front and not let a medical incident turn into a legal situation that embarrassed everyone. He did not ask how Finn was doing. He had not called the hospital. I looked at my father. I had spent 34 years trying to earn something from this man. I had built something real and substantial, and he had never acknowledged it because my sister was his mirror and his legacy, and I was just the one who left. I told him I understood. I told him I would see him at the gala. He looked relieved. He should not have been. My brother-in-law called the hospital billing department that same morning and initiated a freeze on the family corporate credit card tied to Finn's account. The billing coordinator caught me in the hallway to explain the insurance freeze with visible discomfort, clearly expecting me to fall apart. I handed her firm's business debit card. The transaction cleared in 8 seconds. She printed a zero-balance receipt and handed it to me with a different expression than the one she had walked in with. I also retained a child endangerment attorney, a woman in Jacksonville who had won 3 high-profile cases involving deliberate harm to minors, and I arranged, through a contact in the development finance space, to quietly acquire 2 of the outstanding commercial loans on my father's company portfolio. The loans had flexible ownership clauses. My firm completed the purchases through 2 of our operating entities before close of business Thursday. Finn woke up the following afternoon. His voice was rough and small, and the first thing he did was reach for my hand, and the second thing was cry, not dramatically, just the quiet kind of crying that happens when fear finally drains out of a small body. I held him and let him. When he was calmer, he told me what had happened. He said his aunt had been very nice when she brought the snack. He ate 2 crackers before his throat started feeling wrong. He went looking for his backpack because he knew what to do. We had practiced, he knew, but his backpack was not where he left it. My nephew Beckett told him to stop making such a big deal about it and that he was being a baby. By the time Finn made it to the kitchen to find his grandmother, everything went fuzzy. My mother had been in that kitchen. She saw him come in. She had called my sister, not 911. My sister had not called anyone either, for the 17 minutes between when Finn collapsed and when Mrs. Calloway came to return a casserole dish and look through the glass and saw a small boy on the floor. Mrs. Calloway called 911 before she finished pressing the doorbell. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. The attending physician told me afterward that 4 minutes had been the difference. I wiped the tears from Finn's cheeks with my thumb. I told him he had done everything right. I told him Mrs. Calloway was one of the bravest people I had ever heard of, and that when he was feeling better, we were going to bring her the nicest flowers we could find. He thought about this and said she probably liked roses. I told him we would get roses then. He asked me if the people who took his EpiPen were going to get in trouble. I told him yes. He said okay, and then he fell back asleep holding my hand. The gala was held at the Riverside Club downtown, a venue my father had helped renovate and considered partly his own. I wore charcoal slacks and a structured blazer, and the kind of posture that 8 years of high-stakes federal work builds into your spine without you noticing. I had my credential case in my inside pocket. I had my tablet. My father's security at the door recognized me and moved to block my entry. They radioed inside. 30 seconds later, my father's event coordinator came out looking flustered, and I told her quietly that I had a federal matter to resolve with one of the evening's guests, and that she could let me in or explain to the Jacksonville field office why she had impeded a contractor operating under federal jurisdiction. She stepped aside. The ballroom held 200 people. Crystal and candles and the specific self-congratulation of rooms full of people who believed their success was entirely self-made. My father was at the front working the crowd, deep voice, broad laugh, the handshake that makes people feel chosen. My sister stood beside him in a green cocktail dress. My brother-in-law was behind her, drink in hand, smile prepared. I walked along the wall until I was 20 feet from the dais. My father saw me when he turned to greet the chamber president. The laugh stopped. He crossed the room with a controlled expression that only people who knew him well would recognize as fury. He said through his teeth that I was not welcome and needed to leave before he made a scene. I told him I had some information about his incoming operations director that his investors might want to hear before the announcement. I held up my tablet. I turned it so he could see the opening page of Reed's dossier, the wire transfer records, the Beaufort capital structure, my father's company name at the top of the page. He stared at it. My brother-in-law arrived at my father's shoulder with a practiced smile and a hand on his arm and told him not to worry, that he would handle this. I looked at my brother-in-law and said, loud enough for the 3 nearest tables to hear, that federal warrants for his arrest had been filed that morning. The smile stayed on his face for 1.5 seconds, then it went. I did not yell. I let my voice carry the way I had learned to let it carry in courtrooms. I told the room that my brother-in-law had been using my father's real estate company to process fraudulent wire transfers to offshore shell accounts for 18 months. That the amount identified so far was over $1 million. That he had opened a shadow trust using my 8-year-old son's name and social security number as a fall guy for a federal investigation. That my son was currently in the pediatric wing of Baptist Medical Center because my brother-in-law and my sister had deliberately given him a known allergen and removed his emergency medication from his reach. The room went very quiet. My sister said my name in a warning tone from across the room. My father turned slowly and looked at Hollis. My brother-in-law said I was lying. He said I was unstable. He said my federal background had clearly left me paranoid and that I was embarrassing the family and that if anyone had a recording device out, he would sue them personally. He said it all with conviction. He was good. But the investors in that room were not listening to his words anymore. They were watching my father's face. My father was a man who had built a company over 40 years on his ability to read risk, and right now the calculation was not going the way my brother-in-law needed it to go. I opened the tablet fully and handed it to the company's chief financial officer, who was seated 2 tables away. I told him to look at page 6, the internal account codes used for the fraudulent consulting transfers. Those codes would match entries in the company's ledger. The CFO's face as he read was its own closing argument. The ballroom doors opened. Agent Dunbar came in with 4 other federal agents, all in bureau credentials, all in suits rather than tactical gear because he knew exactly what kind of room this was. He gave me a brief nod as he passed. His team moved toward my brother-in-law with a steadiness that made the whole room understand that something real was happening. My brother-in-law tried to move toward the kitchen exit. 2 agents were already there. They placed him under arrest at the center of the ballroom, in front of everyone gathered to celebrate his promotion, and they read him his rights in the formal cadence of a federal proceeding, and not one person in that room made a sound. My sister sat at her table and stared at the centerpiece. She did not look at her husband as they walked him out. She did not look at my father. My father stood at the side of the room holding a glass he had forgotten to put down. He looked old in a way he had not looked before tonight. He looked at me, and for the first time in my memory there was no performance in his face, no calculation. Just a man who understood completely and too late what he had thrown away. He crossed the room toward me slowly and stopped a few feet away. He said my name like a question rather than a command. He asked what would happen to the company. I told him that the 2 commercial loans my firm had acquired on Thursday had a change of creditor clause that triggered a full operational audit upon evidence of federal fraud within the borrowing entity. The audit had been formally initiated that morning. Until it was resolved, no major asset transfers could occur without my firm's approval. He could not move significant capital or close major deals without my authorization. He was quiet for a long moment, then he asked if there was any way to save what he had built. I told him there was. I told him it would require his full cooperation with Agent Dunbar's investigation and his willingness to start making different choices about who and what he was willing to protect. I told him I did not want to destroy what he had spent 40 years building. I told him I wanted Finn to have a grandfather worth knowing. But I told him that was going to have to be his decision. I did not wait for his answer. I said goodnight and I walked out through the ballroom doors and into the warm Jacksonville evening, and I sat in my car for a few quiet minutes before driving back to the hospital. Finn was awake when I came in. He was watching something on the hospital television with the sound turned low, and he looked up when I came through the door and gave me the particular small smile of a child who is tired but safe. I sat on the edge of his bed. I told him it was over. He asked if the bad people were going to be punished. I told him yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was glad, and then he asked if we could get pancakes when he got out, and I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in 4 days. My brother-in-law was indicted on 6 federal counts including wire fraud, conspiracy, and criminal use of a minor's identity. The financial trail Reed had assembled was meticulous and complete. He was looking at 7 to 12 years. My sister accepted a plea agreement that included 5 years of supervised probation, a permanent restraining order keeping her 300 feet from Finn, and mandatory cooperation with the federal audit. The lifestyle dissolved within months, accounts frozen, the house in Hollis's name seized, the friends who had gathered around her during the years of good dinners and curated posts gone quiet as soon as the news broke. My nephew was 10 years old, and 10-year-old boys are the product of whoever is raising them. I did not blame him. The courts handled what needed handling. That part was not mine to carry. My mother called 6 weeks later from a friend's guest room. She wanted to explain why she had called my sister instead of 911. I listened to the whole call. Then I told her I needed time and that when I was ready to have a real conversation I would reach out, for Finn's sake, because he deserved a grandmother who was trying. But not yet. My father cooperated fully with the investigation. The audit my firm conducted took 4 months. At the end of it, the company was smaller but clean, and my father asked me if I would consider a seat on the board. I told him I would think about it. I am still thinking about it. That is progress for us. 2 weeks after Finn was discharged, on a Saturday morning when he was fully recovered, and back to arguing with me about whether dinosaurs could have been warm-blooded, we brought roses to Mrs. Calloway. She answered the door in a housecoat and reading glasses and seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would make a fuss over her. She said she had just done what anyone would do. Finn looked up at her and said not everyone would. She patted his cheek and said he was a very sensible young man. He stood a little straighter when she said it. We drove from her house to the diner with the individual jukeboxes at every booth. Finn ordered the blueberry stack and ate every bite, and then looked at mine with the expression he always gets right before he asks for half. I slid my plate across before he even finished the thought. Some things you do not need to wait to be asked.